By the winter of 1942, the German Luftwaffe was facing a nightmare it had not anticipated. The Eastern Front had swallowed entire armies, and the once invincible blitzkrieg was slowing under the endless weight of Soviet armor. The T-34, with its sloped armor and rugged simplicity, had become the symbol of Soviet resilience. German anti-tank guns were struggling, and the ground forces cried out for a weapon capable of piercing the steel beasts that roamed the snow-covered steppes. The answer, as it turned out, came not from a factory producing tanks or artillery, but from the mind of an aging aviator, Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the Luftwaffe's most feared Stuka pilot. The Junkers Ju-87G Stuka had already earned a terrifying reputation in the early years of the war. Its screaming sirens, the Jericho trumpets, became the soundtrack of blitzkrieg. Psychological warfare at 400 kilometers per hour. From the skies above Poland, France, and the Low Countries, the Stuka delivered precision strikes that shattered enemy morale and paved the way for lightning-fast ground advances. But by 1941, over the skies of the Soviet Union, the Stuka's age was showing. Soviet fighters like the Yak-1 and Leg-3 were faster, and the Stuka's slow speed made it a flying target. Many Luftwaffe commanders believed the aircraft's time had passed. Yet, for Rudel and his comrades, the Stuka was not obsolete. It merely needed to evolve. Rudel had seen firsthand the devastation caused by Soviet armor during the Battle of Moscow. He understood that Germany could not match the Soviets tank for tank. What the Wehrmacht needed was a surgical weapon, something that could strike from the air with pinpoint accuracy, destroying tanks before they reached the front lines. His proposal was daring: transform the Stuka from a dive bomber into a flying anti-tank cannon. Engineers at Junkers listened. They replaced the underwing bomb racks with two massive 37mm BK-37 cannons, each capable of firing armor-piercing tungsten core shells at 160 rounds per minute. The new variant was born, the Ju-87G, nicknamed Kanonenvogel, or Cannon Bird. In early 1943, the first modified Stukas took to the skies over the Eastern Front. Their silhouette was unmistakable. The broad wings now burdened by long gun pods, their barrels gleaming under the pale sun. Each pull of the trigger could send two streams of fire into enemy armor. The guns recoiled so violently that pilots joked the aircraft felt like it was being kicked in the stomach every time it fired. Yet Rudel and his unit quickly learned to master the weapon. They flew low, often under 100 meters, lining up Soviet columns with deadly precision. One burst from the 37mm guns could ignite the thin top armor of a T-34, turning it into a flaming wreck. Reports from the front astonished the German high command. Rudel alone was soon credited with dozens, then hundreds of tank kills. His squadron became a legend among Wehrmacht troops, a ghostly presence in the sky that Soviet tankers came to dread. When the whine of the Ju-87's inverted gull wings echoed across the plains, Soviet crews would scatter for cover, often abandoning their vehicles in panic. But the Kanonenvogel was not without flaws. It was heavier, slower, and required absolute courage to fly in the face of Soviet anti-aircraft fire. Many who attempted to replicate Rudel's success did not return. Technically, the transformation of the Stuka into a tank killer represented a remarkable fusion of old and new. The aircraft itself was a relic of pre-war design: fixed landing gear, low speed, and minimal armor. Yet in the right hands, with the right weapons, it became a predator perfectly adapted to its prey. The 37mm BK guns, originally adapted from ground-based Flak 18 anti-aircraft weapons, could penetrate up to 75mm of armor, more than enough to breach a T-34 AT's top plating. Pilots often flew in pairs or trios, coordinating attacks to cover each other from enemy fighters. Their missions demanded not just skill, but nerves of steel. The margin for error was zero. A single hit from ground fire could tear the fragile plane apart. By mid-1943, the Ju-87G was being deployed along critical sectors: Orel, Kursk, and later, the Dnieper Bend. Its introduction coincided with one of the largest armored clashes in history, the Battle of Kursk. It was there that the flying cannon would face its ultimate test. As thousands of Soviet tanks rolled forward and German panzers counterattacked, Rudel's squadron was unleashed to stem the tide. The Stukas swooped low, unleashing their 37mm cannons upon the advancing armor columns. Witnesses on the ground described the sight as both awe-inspiring and horrifying. Long lines of burning tanks stretching across the plains, black smoke curling into the summer sky. For the Luftwaffe, this new role breathed temporary life into an aging aircraft and boosted morale among hard-pressed German troops. But even as the Stuka proved its lethality against armor, the balance of the air war was shifting irreversibly. The Red Air Force was growing stronger, its pilots better trained, and its aircraft more advanced. The skies that once belonged to the Stuka were becoming ever more dangerous. The age of dominance was fading. Yet, for one brief and bloody moment, the Ju-87G stood as a symbol of ingenuity, born from desperation, a weapon forged at the edge of defeat. As 1943 drew to a close, the Eastern Front was a graveyard of machines. Burned-out hulks of T-34s and Panzers lay scattered across the frozen steppes. In that desolate landscape, one sound still sent a chill through every Soviet tanker's heart: the low, thunderous growl of a Stuka diving toward the earth, its twin cannons flashing in the pale light of dawn. By the spring of 1943, the Eastern Front had transformed into a vast furnace of destruction. Operation Barbarossa's initial blitzkrieg successes had long turned into a war of attrition. The Red Army, once shattered, was reborn under new leadership and relentless industrial production. It was within this crucible that the Ju-87G Stuka, the flying cannon, would face its ultimate test. The winter of 1942-43 had already changed everything. The disaster at Stalingrad had broken the illusion of German invincibility. When the snow melted, the front lines were littered with wrecks of panzers, guns, and dreams of a short war. The Luftwaffe was still a formidable force, but it could no longer claim dominance over the skies as it had in 1941. Soviet Yak-1s, La-5s, and the agile Il-2 Sturmovik began to appear in overwhelming numbers. To the east, the Soviets massed their new T-34s and KV-1s, armored beasts that shrugged off the 37mm and even 50mm guns of most German aircraft. The Wehrmacht needed a miracle, or at least a weapon that could stem the armored tide. That weapon would be the Ju-87G, reborn from the bones of the outdated dive bomber. Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the legendary Stuka ace, became the face and soul of this transformation. Flying over the vast steppes, Rudel turned the Ju-87G into a scalpel of destruction. Armed with twin 37mm Bordkanon BK-37 cannons mounted beneath each wing, the aircraft could pierce the armor of a T-34 with precision fire. The pilots soon discovered that the secret was not in spraying bullets, but in accuracy. Each cannon carried only 12 rounds per gun. A Stuka pilot had just 1 or 2 passes to strike his prey, and in those seconds, success or death balanced on the edge of the gun sight. The G-model Stuka was slower than its predecessor, weighed down by the heavy cannons and armor plating. It could not dive steeply anymore. Instead, it became a low-flying predator, gliding above the treetops, hunting columns of tanks and supply convoys. On quiet mornings, German troops on the ground would hear the distant growl of engines, followed by the heavy thud of cannon fire and the sudden blossoming of flames in Soviet formations. Rudel's tactics soon spread across the front. The Panzerknacker, tank busters, as they were affectionately nicknamed, flew in small, disciplined formations, often in pairs. They would ambush Soviet armor just as they crossed rivers or emerged from forested roads. The effect on Soviet morale was immediate and severe. Soldiers learned to fear the silhouette of the gull-winged aircraft as much as they feared German Tigers. Yet, the Stuka's success came at a price. Flying at such low altitudes made them easy targets for anti-aircraft guns and small arms fire. A single lucky burst from a machine gun could shatter a vital control line. Many pilots never returned from their missions. Even Rudel himself was shot down multiple times, wounded, and yet returned to the air each time with undiminished determination. The Eastern Front was not merely a battlefield, it was a landscape of endurance. The Stuka units were constantly on the move, relocating from one dirt airstrip to another, sometimes operating within artillery range of Soviet guns. They slept in the mud, repaired their aircraft under the moonlight, and launched missions at dawn against an enemy that grew stronger by the week. The Ju-87G became a weapon of defiance rather than dominance, a symbol of German ingenuity fighting against overwhelming odds. The Luftwaffe could no longer guarantee full air cover. Soviet fighters prowled the skies, and every sortie carried the risk of sudden interception. Stuka pilots adapted by hugging the ground, using the terrain as their ally, emerging from valleys or forest edges like hawks. As the Battle of Kursk approached in July 1943, the Ju-87G was ready for its greatest trial. Kursk was to be the largest tank battle in history, and for the Luftwaffe, it was a chance to prove that air power could still tip the balance. Hundreds of German bombers and attack aircraft assembled for Operation Citadel, including the new generation of flying cannons. In the opening days, Stukas claimed dozens of Soviet tanks destroyed. The BK-37's tungsten-cored shells sliced through armor, leaving smoking hulks in their wake. Rudel's own squadron reported entire armored columns halted under their attacks. But despite these victories, the tide was already turning. Soviet numbers, logistics, and air defenses proved overwhelming. For every tank destroyed, another seemed to appear on the horizon. The summer skies of Kursk were thick with smoke, tracer fire, and desperation. Soviet anti-aircraft crews learned to track the slow-flying Ju-87Gs with deadly precision. Luftwaffe losses climbed sharply. Even as they claimed hundreds of tanks destroyed, the Stukas were dying faster than they could be replaced. By August, the operation had failed. Kursk had drained Germany of its last offensive spirit. The Stuka's era as a symbol of dominance had ended. Now, it became a tool of survival. And yet, within that failure, the Ju-87G had earned its place in military legend. Against all odds, it had proven that skill, courage, and adaptation could still turn the tide, even if only temporarily. The Eastern Front's endless steppe would never again belong to the Luftwaffe. The days of the screaming dive and the invincible blitzkrieg were gone, but the flying cannon had shown that innovation could still make the enemy bleed. Each sortie was a duel against time, a race between life and death, between past glory and inevitable defeat. As the summer of 1943 faded into the long, bloody years of retreat, the Ju-87G remained the last echo of a lost age of precision warfare. Its pilots, flying against the sun, left behind not just wreckage, but the legend of men who dared to turn the tide with nothing but courage and steel wings. By late 1943, the name Hans-Ulrich Rudel had already become a living legend among the soldiers of the Eastern Front. To the German infantry pinned beneath the thunder of Soviet tanks, the faint wail of a Stuka engine meant hope. To the Soviets, it meant death descending from the clouds. Rudel was not merely a pilot, he was the embodiment of persistence and precision, a man who turned the Ju-87G from an outdated dive bomber into a weapon of surgical destruction. Over time, his legend grew beyond imagination. More than 2,500 combat missions, over 500 Soviet tanks destroyed, bridges shattered, artillery silenced, even a battleship crippled. But behind those numbers was a story of survival, obsession, and a relentless will that seemed to defy both nature and war itself. Rudel's rise was not preordained. Early in the war, his superiors had considered him too unfit for combat, too slow in adapting to aerial warfare's brutal tempo. Yet the young man from Konradswaldau was possessed by an almost spiritual belief in duty. He volunteered for every mission, studied every aspect of his aircraft, and transformed flying into both science and instinct. By the time he took command of his Stuka wing, Rudel had already established new tactics that turned the Ju-87G into a precision weapon against armored forces. He learned to strike from an oblique angle, diving not vertically, but along the side of a tank column, targeting the thinner armor of engine compartments and turrets. His crewmen learned to trust his instincts completely. When Rudel chose a target, destruction followed within seconds. The conditions under which he and his comrades operated were beyond human endurance. Soviet fighters, especially the Yak-9 and La-5FN, dominated the skies, and every sortie was a deadly gamble. The Ju-87G, slow and ungainly, had no chance in a dogfight. Rudel often flew barely 50 meters above the ground, skimming tree lines and frozen rivers to evade detection. Anti-aircraft fire was constant, a rain of steel that tore through wings and engines. Many of his comrades were shot down before they ever reached their targets. Yet Rudel survived, again and again. His aircraft was hit more than 30 times throughout the war, and he was shot down over a dozen. Once, after crash landing behind Soviet lines, he escaped capture by trekking for days through enemy territory, wounded and half-frozen, carrying his wounded gunner on his back. But survival alone did not make Rudel extraordinary. It was his unyielding return to combat, every single time. In 1944, during one of his missions near the Dniester River, his right leg was shattered by anti-aircraft fire. Most men would have been grounded for life. Rudel refused amputation until infection left him no choice. Within weeks of losing his leg, he was back in the cockpit, flying with a prosthetic limb. His commanders protested. He ignored them. The Soviets, now fully aware of his reputation, reportedly placed a bounty of 100,000 rubles on his head. Rudel wore it as a badge of honor. To the end of the war, he continued to fly, even as the front lines collapsed and the Reich fell apart around him. The mystique of Hans-Ulrich Rudel went beyond his kills and decorations. He represented a rare type of soldier, one who believed that skill and willpower could outlast any material disadvantage. To him, war was not chaos, but an arena for mastery. He treated the Ju-87G as an extension of his body, understanding every vibration, every sound, every weakness. His precision was legendary. He could identify tank models from thousands of feet in the air, strike the weakest point, and withdraw before enemy guns found him. His wingmen called him Der Unsterbliche, the Immortal. Yet even Rudel could not change the outcome of history. As 1944 turned to 1945, Germany's skies darkened with Allied bombers, and the Eastern Front began to collapse in on itself. The once mighty Luftwaffe had been reduced to fragments. Fuel shortages forced many units to stay grounded. Pilots were now young boys with barely 20 hours of flight training. Rudel, now a colonel, led what remained of the Stuka units in a desperate series of rearguard actions. He flew missions over East Prussia and Pomerania, attacking Soviet tank spearheads that were closing in on Berlin. His squadron, battered but unbroken, still managed to inflict heavy losses, even as they knew the war was lost. Rudel's personal diaries and reports from this period reveal the psychological transformation of the Luftwaffe elite. They no longer fought for victory. They fought for survival, for comradeship, for the illusion that courage still mattered. The Stuka, obsolete by all standards, had become a symbol of defiance. On some days, Rudel flew up to 15 sorties, refueling and rearming between attacks, often without rest or food. He wrote later that the sound of the BK-37 cannons was a heartbeat of steel, a rhythm that drowned out the collapse of everything else around him. Even as Soviet forces advanced westward, he refused to abandon his machine. In February 1945, during one of his final missions near the Oder River, Rudel destroyed 11 tanks in a single day. It was his last great victory. A month later, as Berlin was surrounded, he led his last Stuka sorties, covering retreating German troops. When the end finally came, Rudel surrendered to American forces rather than the Soviets, knowing that his fame would make him a target for revenge. He walked into captivity not as a defeated man, but as a relic of an age that had already vanished. Rudel's story remains one of the most complex in aviation history. To some, he was a brilliant tactician and one of the greatest pilots who ever lived. To others, a fanatic whose loyalty to a lost cause tainted his legend. Yet, in the brutal theater of the Eastern Front, where survival was an act of will, Rudel and his Stuka became symbols of human tenacity in the face of overwhelming odds. His Ju-87G was more than a machine. It was the embodiment of precision, persistence, and defiance. The flying cannon had found its perfect master, and through him it had earned its immortality, not as a weapon of conquest, but as a symbol of what it meant to fight until the end, even when all hope was gone. By the beginning of 1944, the Ju-87, once the terror of Europe's skies, was living on borrowed time. The world that had birthed it was vanishing. The Luftwaffe, which had once dominated the continent with its precision and speed, was now a shadow of its former self. On the Eastern Front, the Red Air Force had grown into an unstoppable giant. Factories beyond the Urals churned out aircraft faster than Germany could shoot them down. For every Stuka that took off, there were 10 Soviet fighters waiting in the air above. Yet still, the Ju-87G, the flying cannon, refused to die. It continued to fight, limping through the chaos of a war that had turned against its creators. The decline of the Stuka was not sudden. It was a slow, painful unraveling. The very traits that had once made it fearsome, its deliberate pace, its steady aim, its dive-bombing accuracy, became liabilities in a new kind of war. The skies over the Eastern Front were now a storm of speed and firepower. Soviet Yak-3s and La-7s, powered by robust radial engines and flown by increasingly skilled pilots, cut through the air with predatory ease. The Ju-87, even in its G model form, was sluggish, its heavy cannons reducing its agility. When intercepted, escape was almost impossible. Its survival depended on ambush, on cunning, on flying so low that the treetops themselves became shields. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe's command structure was collapsing under the weight of attrition. Airfields were constantly bombed, fuel was scarce, and trained pilots were irreplaceable. The once proud Geschwader, wings, that had carried the black crosses of the Reich across Europe were reduced to skeletal squadrons. The Stuka's role shifted from attack to desperation. It was no longer the sharp blade of blitzkrieg. It was the shield for retreating troops, the last friend of the soldiers on the ground. Infantrymen would still cheer when they saw the angular silhouette of a Ju-87 overhead, its twin BK-37 cannons glinting in the sun. To them, the Stuka was proof that someone still fought for them from above, even as the front lines crumbled. In the summer of 1944, Operation Bagration, the Soviet assault on Army Group Center, shattered the German Eastern Front. Entire divisions were encircled and annihilated. The Luftwaffe scrambled every remaining aircraft to stem the tide. Over the smoldering forests of Belarus and the endless fields of Ukraine, the last Stukas went to war. They attacked tank columns, pontoon bridges, and supply convoys with ruthless precision. For a moment, their old brilliance returned. Veteran pilots like Rudel and his comrades destroyed dozens of vehicles in a single day. But there were too few of them, and too many enemies. Each victory came at the cost of another airfield lost, another base overrun, another pilot never returning. The tactical landscape of the Eastern Front had also changed. The Soviets had learned. Their tank crews spread out instead of moving in columns, reducing the efficiency of air attacks. They used camouflage nets, smoke screens, and decoy vehicles to confuse the German attackers. Their anti-aircraft defense became far more sophisticated, with layers of machine guns and cannons guarding every major formation. The once invincible Ju-87 was now hunted prey. Pilots reported walls of flak that filled the air like black storms. Many Stukas were shot down before even reaching their targets. For those who survived, the missions were brutal, short, chaotic, and increasingly hopeless. Yet, despite the odds, the Ju-87G continued to prove its worth in one grim aspect: tank killing. The 37mm Bordkanon, though cumbersome, remained one of the most effective air-to-ground weapons of the war. Soviet tankers dreaded its shrieking shells. Veterans recalled how a single hit from the Stuka's cannons could ignite a T-34 like a torch, the fuel and ammunition erupting in an instant. In this deadly dance of machine against machine, skill mattered more than numbers. Experienced Stuka pilots learned to time their attacks with surgical precision, waiting until a tank turned its weaker rear armor toward them before striking. It was warfare at its most personal. Pilot against tanker, man against man, fought at treetop height. By late 1944, as the Red Army reached the Vistula, the Luftwaffe was effectively fighting from extinction. Jet aircraft like the Me-262 had begun to appear, signaling the future of aerial warfare, but the Stuka still lingered in the skies, an anachronism of a bygone age. Its crews flew on out of loyalty, not hope. In the bitter winter of 1944-45, they launched desperate attacks to delay the Soviet advance into East Prussia and Silesia. Each mission was a one-way journey. Rudel himself continued to lead these flights, even after losing his leg, even after the Reich had become a smoldering ruin. The final months of the war saw the Stuka fade into myth. On the ground, civilians and soldiers alike recognized its unmistakable shape. The gull wings, the engine's growl, the thunder of the cannons. To the Germans, it was the sound of resistance. To the Soviets, it was the echo of an old terror. And yet, in those dying days, there was no longer victory in its flight, only endurance. The once glorious dive bomber that had terrorized Poland, France, and the Balkans was now a relic, kept alive by men who refused to surrender. By April 1945, as Berlin fell and the Third Reich collapsed in flames, The last Ju-87s flew their final sorties over Czechoslovakia and Austria. Most were destroyed on the ground, burned to prevent capture. A few were seized by the Soviets and studied as curiosities of outdated engineering. The Stuka's scream, that mechanical wail that had once defined blitzkrieg, was silenced forever. But its legacy, written in the steel and blood of the Eastern Front, would endure. The death of the Stuka was not the death of its spirit. It symbolized an age when courage and precision could change the tide of battle even for a moment. It represented the tragic beauty of a weapon that outlived its purpose, but not its legend. As the smoke cleared over the ruins of Europe, the story of the Ju-87G flying cannon remained, not as a tale of conquest, but as a testament to human ingenuity and the will to fight on, long after reason said the war was lost. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Ju-87 Stuka, once a symbol of unstoppable power, lay buried beneath the ashes of a ruined continent. Its factories were in rubble, its pilots dead or captured, its engines silent. Yet even in defeat, the flying cannon refused to be forgotten. The story of the Ju-87G and the men who flew it would transcend the boundaries of its time to become one of the most fascinating legends of aerial warfare. Its very existence told the story of how innovation, courage, and adaptation could create icons even in the darkest days of war. The Stuka's tale did not end with Germany's surrender. It began to live anew in memory, myth, and history. In the early years after the war, much of the world viewed the Stuka through the lens of terror. Its screaming sirens, the infamous Jericho trumpets, had become the sound of Nazi aggression, echoing through newsreels and propaganda. Yet those who studied the Eastern Front understood that by the time the Ju-87G appeared, the Stuka had evolved far beyond that early image. The G model was no longer a symbol of blitzkrieg. It was a weapon of precision and desperation. A tank killer, an aerial sniper, a relic turned legend. Its cannons, the twin 37mm Bordkanonen, represented the height of practical field modification, proof that even obsolete machines could be reborn through necessity. Engineers across the world would later study its design, fascinated by how the Luftwaffe had transformed a dive bomber into one of the first true dedicated close air support aircraft. The Stuka's influence extended into the post-war doctrines of both East and West. The concept of specialized ground attack planes, aircraft designed to operate at low altitude, providing direct support to troops, found new life in the Soviet Il-10, the American A-1 Skyraider, and decades later in the A-10 Thunderbolt Thunderers. Often called the modern Stuka, the philosophy was the same: armor the aircraft, arm it with heavy cannons, and send it low over the battlefield to hunt tanks and vehicles with precision fire. The legacy of the Ju-87G lived on in every machine that carried that philosophy forward. Its combination of psychological impact and deadly accuracy left a mark on military thinking that no general could ignore. But perhaps the Stuka's greatest legacy was human rather than mechanical. The men who flew it embodied an era when the limits of technology were overcome by sheer willpower. Pilots like Hans-Ulrich Rudel, Ernst Kupfer, and their comrades became symbols of endurance, not of ideology, but of the warrior's craft. They had flown outdated machines into impossible situations, often outnumbered and outgunned, and yet had made their mark through precision and discipline. Rudel's post-war memoirs, Stuka Pilot, became both revered and controversial, offering a rare glimpse into the mind of a man who had lived through the extremes of modern warfare. His words reflected the duality of the Stuka's legacy: pride in mastery, shadowed by the tragedy of the cause it served. The aircraft itself achieved a strange immortality. Surviving examples of the Ju-87 were scattered across Europe after the war. The Soviets captured a few for testing, dismantling them piece by piece to study their armor and weapon systems. The British and Americans displayed captured Stukas in war museums, where they stood as grim reminders of a war that had reshaped the world. For decades, model builders, historians, and aviation enthusiasts would study its lines, its engineering, its purpose. The Stuka became not just an artifact of war, but a symbol of an era when courage and innovation walked hand in hand with destruction. In the decades that followed, as Europe rebuilt and the wounds of war began to scar over, the myth of the Stuka transformed. It was no longer just the aircraft of the invader. It became a case study in design, a lesson in adaptation, and a reflection of the human condition in war. It showed that even a machine could have a story, a rise, a fall, and a legacy. In documentaries and books, the Ju-87G often stood as a metaphor for the German war effort itself. Brilliant, efficient, but doomed by overreach and exhaustion. Its final chapter on the Eastern Front mirrored the fall of the Reich. Courageous, futile, and tragic. For historians, the Stuka remains one of the most studied aircraft of World War II because it represents both technological ingenuity and tactical evolution. It began as a dive bomber for a fast-moving war of conquest and ended as a tank killer in a slow, grinding war of survival. That transition captured the story of Germany's war effort, from blitzkrieg to desperation. Its every rivet told a story of adaptation under pressure, of engineers and pilots trying to outwit a fate that had already been sealed. And beyond the numbers and statistics, the flying cannon endures in the imagination because it symbolizes something timeless, the human will to fight on when everything is lost. It stands beside the Spitfire, the Mustang, and the Zero not just as a weapon, but as an icon of a generation that took to the skies when the world was burning. The Ju-87G's roar has long faded from the air, but its legend remains alive, whispered in the hangars of history, etched into the steel of every aircraft that dares to fly low and strike hard. In the end, the Ju-87G was not a perfect machine. It was slow, vulnerable, and doomed from the start by the rapid evolution of the war. But in its imperfection, it found greatness. Its pilots turned limitations into strengths, transforming an obsolete bomber into a weapon of mythic precision. It became a symbol not of victory, but of endurance. The will to keep flying through fire. The belief that skill could still matter in a world consumed by chaos. When the last Stuka fell silent over the fields of Eastern Europe, it left behind more than wreckage. It left behind a legend of courage, invention, and the fragile beauty of machines built for war. The flying cannon had carved its place into history, not through conquest, but through the sheer audacity of its existence. And even now, decades later, when one sees its distinctive silhouette in a museum or a film reel, one can almost hear that low growl of its engine, that steady heartbeat of steel, and remember a time when men and machines danced on the edge of history, refusing to fall until the very end.